of the meeting. Apologies for the fact that we changed the time and date of the meeting last time. We realised that after the last meeting, when we'd asked people to break into small groups and convene discussions around the objectives that they'd signed up to, that not every group had had an opportunity to meet. So given that the purpose of this group is to pull together those discussions and to sort of reflect and provide advice and guidance and sort of, direct the development of those different objectives, it felt appropriate to allocate that slot so that some of the smaller groups could meet. So specifically, there's been a lot of work on Objective 1. If you could, I don't know who's got the slides. Thank you, Margot. So there's been quite a significant amount of work on the paper that Marinus originally produced with inputs from Marianne, looking at, the sort of framework for determining what evidence for impact is. So a substantive element of today's meeting will be taken up with a discussion around that revised paper, and thanks to everybody who's inputted into that. We'll also present a summary overview on Objective 2, which was looking at reviewing the state of evidence. This pertains specifically to the spreadsheet that was established or was created probably 2 years ago, where people were inputted information about the studies they were intending to or currently leading, and sort of thinking about how we can make that as useful as possible. So Jen, my colleague, and I have been leading on that group, and Jen has kindly offered to feedback today. There will be a discussion also on Objective 3, which is around, what are the evidence gaps in the sector, and how do we start to think about a research agenda. And Objective 4, I think the agreement is that we will just briefly touch upon that, because actually that's very much dependent upon further progress being made in the other 3 objectives, because then this objective will look at how we strengthen what we're doing in relation to these other areas. And then, of course, we're very interested to have a roundup from colleagues on the call in relation to initiatives or, things that they're aware of that are of relevance to this group. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, Florence, for putting together the slide. I appreciate it. So I'll hand over to Marinus. And who else was involved in that group? I think Joe, you were involved, weren't you? And other people have been involved in the discussions around Objective 1. So I'll hand over to my colleagues who've been working on that.
Can't hear you, Marinus.
Oh, is it all okay?
Yes. So let me start. It's providing some update on the paper that we discussed last time, and it has been uploaded a few weeks ago. I think most important changes are the paragraphs on ethics. That was a very welcome addition from the discussion last time. I think it's a critically important part of any study or meta endeavor in this area, that we should take into account specific ethical issues. And we draw some attention to a new statement, a Cape Town statement, that really, I think, emphasizes the need for specific ethics in this area, especially in LMIC's country research. So we try to include that in the statement or in the paper or in the note or whatever you call it, preliminary discussion note. That's the first thing that I would like to draw attention to. And the second one would be a little bit more discussion in this note about the grey literature. And I don't think we have consensus yet in the group, in the preparatory group, even I think in the smaller group, because grey literature is, of course, high quantities present in this field, and nevertheless, I think we should be a little bit worried to not be overwhelmed by that literature, especially because it's our experience that it's almost impossible to process the quantities that have been produced in the past on this level. And so any systematic review, either narrative or meta-analytically, may really suffer from gaps in the already in the search stage of the study, let alone in the screening stage. So it's almost an impossible venture, but we think we might be able to find some solutions to that issue, and certainly many of you would have suggestions. We feel that was the common denominator, I think, of the group, that grey literature might be even in terms of quality better than published literature, and not all published literature, especially in nowadays in predatory journals, might even be having a much lower quality than the average grey literature, but we should hold them to the same type of quality criteria. So ethics and grey literature. There was and I forgot the name of the person who had some comments, very sensible ones.
Donald Wordley.
Donald Wordley. Yeah, I don't know him personally, but he had very sensible comments to make upon the note that we delivered. It's about atypically developing children and youth that seem to be, may I say euphemistically, somewhat neglected in the area, in the sector, at large, in studies, but also in the note in the paper that we are developing here. So I think there should be some paragraph section on the special needs children, as of course a large number of institutionalized children nowadays, adopted children, internationally adopted children with special needs, and they are, for example, in the Lancet Psychiatry meta-analysis, excluded for good reasons, I think, but still they are excluded and they need special attention, I guess, in our work. And so that would be one of the issues that we might discuss also, that the section or some paragraphs on that need to be included here. I think two issues might be important, open questions. The first is we have presented some very global, crude suggestions about feedback mechanism that I think will be very fruitful in this area. There's some feedback mechanism that evaluates proposals in any stage of construction, also finished reports, some kind of not certification, but first and foremost, a constructive dialogue between a committee of experts, substantive experts and methodological experts about proposals for designs, about papers that otherwise would be unrefereed grey literature. So that's one, and the second one is a goal very much away in the future, and that it would be our ambition some point in time to try and see whether we can get a consensus about the type of things that we put forward in the note on what is evidence for what kind of impact. So there's a lot of work to do, but I thank especially Joanna and Sarah for helping us to get going in the second round, and I hope to get your input in this wider audience for further developing this this paper.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Marinus. And I just to reflect, I mean, I know that one of the primary objectives for setting up this evidence for impact working group is to really help us to find a way to sort of bridge the policy practice divide and to sort of, strengthen the quality of evidence generation and research, but hold in balance the need to engage and take practitioners with us and to sort of strengthen the quality of what they're doing, but also not negate the critically important, you know, some of the grey literature as you describe it. So I was really delighted to see the paragraph on grey literature, and I'm interested to hear Joanne and others who I know have been engaged in these discussions. Has the right balance been struck yet? And you know, what do other people think? I'm opening it up more broadly. I can see Sarah. So I'll just first of all, I'll ask those people who've been involved in the group discussions, Marianne, of course, and Justin, I can see you've got your hand up. I'll come to you afterwards if that's okay. So I'll just open it up to other members of that group.
Well, I'll just quickly jump in. It struck me as you were speaking, Marinus, that maybe starting with how something is published is takes you down a certain path, and maybe starting with the quality standards and trying to apply those across whatever, however the research or evidence is shared is a better way of looking at it. I think sometimes dividing things into grey literature and the peer-reviewed is perhaps makes us think in a certain way, and maybe freeing ourselves a little bit from that and just looking at the standards and trying to agree on those standards is more helpful, in making those applicable, finding ways to make those applicable across the spectrum of evidence. But I definitely think, like you've said, there's a lot out there that is of great help in bridging the kind of the divide between research and practice, and trying to bring those pieces closer together is really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree, Joe. And I think that this new draft, from my perspective, does that a little bit better than previous drafts. So I think that, you know, we're on that track.
And Marianne?
Yeah, what we've done is following your suggestion to add somewhat more explanations of ideas and also of definitions, and I hope that's helpful to make the text also useful for everyone in the group.
Yes. And I like this idea, Joe, of you talking about, you know, the standards, because as you mentioned in your in the section on grey literature, you know, there's a discussion around PhD theses and the fact that they are peer reviewed. So, you know, they would meet some of the standards while still being recognised as grey literature. So I think, you know, starting with that sort of standards-based approach and, you know, what constitutes sort of quality research would be helpful for sifting in as well as sifting out. And Justin, I know you wanted to come in.
No, just to add, really, firstly, thanks for everyone who's done the work on it. It's a really good paper. When I come from undertaking qualitative research, I'm always a little sensitive in these things when you read through them as a qual researcher, and you know there's stuff there around objectivity, and you know it's triggering for some of the reviews I've had back from peer-reviewed journals, you know, like child abuse and neglect, that are probably not always the friendliest towards qualitative research, I guess. So that was just some of my initial reflections, and I thought you struck that balance about talking about quality and, you know, some of those challenges in what that means for qualitative researchers, I think. So firstly, thank you for that. But I did wonder around, particularly as we got that, you know, the webinar coming up around participatory research, whether there needs to be something in the paper around the potential for community-based participatory research projects for having an impact, potentially at different levels from systematic reviews. But I did wonder if that was something that was potentially missing from the paper, and the importance of peer research with people with a care experience. And I wondered if that's something to consider adding to it. But yeah, well done on everything that's happened so far with it.
Yeah, they're really excellent suggestions. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, I think that's a smart suggestion, because I think that as researchers who are coming from the top down, that's a different sort of bias, you know, that you're only rely on existing published studies that meet certain quality standards or whatever. That means that there's definitely a bias in what's available to you in shaping your thinking. So that's why participatory research and working with affected communities actually can add to the rigor of research, because you're you're going kind of back to the grassroots. And so I think even if it's not the focus of the paper, having a note about the value of participatory research could add value to it.
And it can still be done with the same level of rigor, can't it? You know, it doesn't, you don't have to qualify, you don't have to sort of sacrifice methodological integrity or robustness, you know, with studies like that. You can still do them to a very high quality. So I think, yeah, I would also definitely support that. And did you say there's going to be a webinar on participatory research? I've missed that, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure Florence will circulate details, but there's a webinar coming up with colleague from Monash at University in Australia. And part of the focus, I think, of their work, Jade Patel's work, is stuff around the potential for it to have an influence with policy actors, you know, and to get the voices and narratives of care experience people in those sorts of forums, working with, you know, they work with the Peak organisation, Create in Australia, to make sure that policy actors are hearing things directly from you know, community-based research practitioners as well. So yeah, it's I think it's got that potential for impact. When you think of the transitioning tool as well that came out a year or two ago, the stuff around the transitioning from residential care, there was a lot in there that spoke about the potential for those narratives of care experience people to really supplement that kind of, I guess, hard evidence, you know, that quant evidence as well, being something that can help with the impact as well. So yeah, just sort of flag that up today after reading it. Yeah.
Excellent, thank
in
you.
And it's not as if participatory research is even not quantitative research either. It's about, you know, if the decision making and the design of studies and what research is actually happening, what research questions are being addressed only happens at the top, that is a sort of bias, right? Because there's also like what exists in the literature, in the evidence base, it's not neutral. It's, you know, what research gets done in the first place is shaped by you know, our world and stuff. So bringing in participatory research approaches and speaking with the people most effective and letting them lead what questions you would get asked is actually a way to in a way to add rigor and reduce bias.
Yeah.
And
I
in
mean,
Australia, just to say, in Australia, which is what Jade is going to talk about, they have very systematic involvement. This research is, as Justin pointed out, really used to directly feed into policymaking, which is really interesting as a model. And so Jade will talk a little bit about that. Thanks, Joe. It is in the calendar. It's in the platform, and Joe has shared the registration.
Sorry. I'm sure I've seen it and just not properly absorbed it. But Marinus, I saw you wanted to come in then.
Yeah, maybe. Would like to share some experiences. First of all, recent experiences with participation of experts by experiences. But in the UK, it's even demanded by Wellcome Trust, for example, the largest financer of research. And we have been doing one of our RCTs on the video feedback intervention with Paul Ramchandani and Christine O'Farrelly, and was organized a committee of people with experiences in the sector that we were interested in and wanted to do the research. And they had input in certain stages of the research process. The same was the case in the meta-analytic adventure in the area of child maltreatment, that experts by experience helped us to shed some lights on some of the quantitative results. It's very important to keep in mind that there's a distinction in expertise, and not only that, also in impact that different interest groups might have on the process of research. I'm going back longer than any of you, I think, unfortunately, maybe, but I'm going back to the 70s of the last century, and there was a an enormous interest in action research in Germany, but also in the Netherlands. And I think we should try and avoid the mistakes made in that era, in which, in fact, the research was indeed not credible anymore, because there was a total confluence between political action and a little bit of scientific research. And so I think it's critically important to differentiate between different stages of the research process. And a very important part of the research process, which is generating relevant questions for research. I think that's one of the stages in which there's a lot of input possible, critical input possible by experts' experience and other stakeholders. And then in the stage in which you try to make sense of data. But in the middle part, I think there are risks we have been experiencing in a couple of 50 years ago in daycare research in Holland, interference by stakeholders because they didn't like the preliminary outcomes, the outcomes that we had drafted in a paper, and wanted to stop publishing this paper and these results, because they felt that it would be negatively mirroring on reflecting on the sector. And I think we should not be I think accept that in all stages there should be this confluence of practice and research. I think clear differentiation between the roles and responsibilities of both parties involved is important to not make the same mistakes as have been made quite a bit in the 70s and beginning of the 80s. So that would be my take on this. But there's a lot to discuss here. What are the boundaries? What kind of stages are you talking about, etc.? But I would like to make it a little bit more concrete in terms of the research cycle. See how responsibilities could be differentiated a bit.
That's really helpful, Marinus. And I'm sure, I mean, a lot of these, the learning and the evolution of these processes will be, captured and familiar to people here and, accessible, because obviously these processes can become politicized, particularly with evaluations, and, we're all familiar with that. So, but I think, it's interesting because I think as long as the processes through which experts who are experienced are engaged in participatory research processes, as long as in the different stages of research, as long as there's clearly defined sort of roles, responsibilities underpinned by training, support, I think it's possible to ameliorate some of these challenges. And I think probably as a research community, it's always important to remember, mistakes, from previous iterations of action research and whatever. But I think we can, capture in the research note how it's possible to engage experts through lived experience and the way in which those inputs and contributions can be managed to, ensure that the methodology remains robust and has integrity, and therefore the findings and recommendations can be trusted. So I think, obviously it's not something we can discuss here in this small group, but I'm sure in this larger group, but I'm sure in the small group, that's something you could take away, Joe and Sarah and, Marion and Marinus, and I'm not sure who else was working on that. And to sort of think about what it might be possible, even if it's just sort of some, an appendix to sort of reflect on the possibilities. So I don't know, I'm mindful of time, and I just
sorry, Tricia, can I suggest, because as part of the group as well, we discussed of this particular group one, we also discussed next step in terms of this paper. And I think that's
Yeah,
quite
that's
an
what I was just about
important.
to.
Okay,
Yeah, I was
great.
just
Thank
about,
you.
Yeah, I was just about to ask.
Thank you.
How are we going to take this forward? So that was going to be my next question. But yeah, next steps. What I mean, has there been based on the discussions that have emerged today, would there be a benefit from having a follow-up conversation with the smaller group to consider some of the feedback that has been received today, and to sort of think about whether and how that can be incorporated within the paper? How would you like to do it, small group one? And what would be your proposal?
I think, yeah, I think that's very efficient and correct to have the next step done by the small group and see how we can include the comments that have been made, and see whether there is another iteration possible of this note. I never expected it to be a very quick process. It's quite complicated material, and so let's go for the long haul and see whether we can make a next step and have a next discussion in this larger group as well.
Yeah, and I wonder whether, based on this upcoming webinar, which is looking at participatory research, whether it might be worth scheduling the next meeting after that, because there may be some lessons that emerge from that webinar that it might be helpful to take on board and incorporate into the next iteration of the paper. But I won't tell you. I mean, you can do your own scheduling. The bigger group meets quarterly, so I'm assuming the next meeting of this group will probably be sometime sort of, July, late June, early July. So between now and then, there'll just be some more work to be done. But I mean, to just reflect, I think everybody, it's really shaping up very well. It's a very robust piece of work, and we're very grateful for the efforts you're all putting into it. It's going to be so important as a foundation document. So thank you for those efforts. Mary, I can see you got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted, I so trust this committee and know where you're coming from. As a sort of, I worry a little bit about the pendulum swinging so far in not privileging peer-reviewed work. And I see dissertations as an example of that I think a dissertation that gets through a committee is one thing. A dissertation that's published is typically, work that has been reviewed more carefully by more independent evaluators. So that's just an example, but I guess I just worry a little bit about the pendulum swinging. But again, I so trust those of you who are working on this that I don't think I need to even say this.
It's always helpful to say, it's always helpful to remind us that what we're aiming for is the utmost robustness, really, and quality of research. So it's always helpful to be reminded. And I don't know if anyone has any final comments, or you guys are happy to take this away and continue to work on it. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Can I just say, Tricia, definitely that's the way to go forward. But we did have within that group discussion around next step, which is, first of all, finalization of this paper and review and more feedback, but also how does that translate to a community? Because the idea is evidence for impact. So the community that works at policy level, advocacy level, but also at programmatic level, and link up to the other objective of this working group, which is around strengthening the use of evidence, strengthening the quality of evidence. We talked about the paper potentially also being followed up with kind of more practical guidance around, or examples of types of use of different types of evidence and methodologies to enable the community to be engaging with a range of methodology, engaging with a range of issues around quality evidence that impacts our policy and practice. So I'm just wondering as well whether that conversation, it'd be worth as well following up on that as part of the small group, but also bringing that to the broader group.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I would definitely think that it would be helpful to consider how, once we've defined what we believe sort of quality evidence could and should look like, the types of support we might be able to provide to the community to sort of strengthen their capacities to use some of the methodology, you know, that we'll be promoting. And, you know, I understand from this next webinar that this is very much looking at the take up by policymakers of evidence produced through participatory means. That, I mean, that's critical, isn't it? Because ultimately what we're trying to do is to generate evidence that will help to influence those with the, you know, potential to create the policies for change. So I mean, I think maybe one of the things to do in a small group is to think what the spin-offs might be. Not that spin-offs is the right word, but you know what I mean, the sort of the next steps might be in relation to taking the what's in that paper forward and helping people to engage with and apply it practically to strengthen the quality of what they're doing. And maybe some recommendations to come out of that next meeting would be helpful.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And we talked about giving examples as well. And so
Yeah.
the webinar, for example, is an example of providing exposure, thinking around different methodologies that are being used and enabling the community. But like, how can this paper as well get to the next stage so we can engage the community with the different types of methodologies, with the different examples that the care community has used to address different aspects of the evidence gaps that we have, for example. So I think that's a really important part as well, to bridge as well what this important paper is trying to do to actually what we're trying to influence in terms of the community's not just awareness, but engagement with evidence and different approaches to get that evidence, if that makes sense.
So it's also about developing competencies, isn't it, I suppose?
That's
and
right.
it might be that we decide, you know, an interesting opportunity might be to deliver a series of short webinars looking at different types of research methods, you know, what's appropriate for what type of research, because, you know, that's often, you know, when people aren't professional researchers, just trying to figure out what type of methodologies to use can be very confusing, can't it? So just giving people a grounding in understanding what might be appropriate for the type of research they're considering. And I think, Joe, you wanted to come in. Was it you, Joe, or?
Yes, sorry, no, I just had a question. Is this different from what's being proposed under Objective 4?
I can't remember what objective
it's very much linked. It's very much linked, but these are all kind of steps. So, you know, the clarification first of what we understand, which is what Marion and you and others have been working on, clarifying what our evidence for impact means and what comes under that. But then, of course, all of that is with the goal of actually promoting quality research in our community, which means also understanding you know, the range of methodologies to achieve different types of evidence, the examples, good examples that are happening around use of different methodologies, and also more rigor in terms of our willingness to share research initiatives, to have colleagues commenting on it. So, but as Tricia said, one of the things we discussed as well was, would it be helpful, for example, to have a series of webinars as well? I mean, many of the actors are very familiar with research methodology, but others are not. And how do we, particularly rooting this into this care agenda? So it does link very much to objectives, actually to the you know, all of the objectives, but it's these are incremental steps to get our community to engage much more with that research agenda and how we're going to achieve it, and how we're going to improve the quality of the research that we have, so we can have clarity around what we use as evidence to achieve impact, to change policy, advocate.
Thanks, Florence. Thanks, Joe. Justin?
Yeah, sorry, my hand thing's not working on my the reactions one, so I just put my actual hand
That's
up.
fine.
And I think that is partly why I think the tone of this has got to be right as well, the way it comes across, because there are a lot of people in NGOs that are doing bits of research on these things to the best of their abilities, right? And I think it needs to be written in such a way that's really constructive and encouraging people to improve their research, and not I mean, there was one word in it that I think the word sloppy was in it. And I did sort of think maybe that's perhaps not the right phrasing, and whether that could be, I don't know if I'm just being too sensitive, whether it could be a bit more in a more of a constructive tone around those sorts of things as well. Maybe something's lost in translation in the way it's written as well. But I do think, I wonder if there's something in that knowing that the purpose of this is for people to do the best research they can, right? To have the most impact that they can have with their research. And yeah, just I think maybe it's worth reading over the tone of the whole document as well to ensure that it's in that sort of encouraging light, maybe.
Yeah, I like that.
Maybe just about this this sloppy. I must confess that might have escaped my pencil. The point is that I'm guilty of having done sloppy research. I think it exists out there, and I think it's very damaging to progress, to impact, and all of that. So, but we will be very careful, and very careful also not to exempt ourselves of doing things that are not really productive. But thank you for the feedback here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, reflecting what Mary says, we want to set the bar really high, but then we want to make sure that people feel it's within their capacity to reach that bar. So we want to sort of inspire and engage and take people on the journey rather than terrifying. So tone is really important in that, isn't it? Victoria, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thank you, and a really fascinating conversation. And I haven't jumped in because I'm afraid I haven't read the paper, and my apologies for that. But what I'm hearing from the conversation is just making me think a little bit about the evidence for impact. We predominantly seem to talk about the impact on policy, which is super important, of course. But I'm just thinking about the impact on young people's lives and on their own agency, because I think research can be a really powerful tool for care experienced or children who is still in care to take a different perspective on and dig into and explore their own experiences. And we've done research over the past year or two around that kind of agency and empowerment and how that plays into research. And I would really welcome some attention to that in the way that research has an impact on the skills and capacities and agency and power of young people as well.
And also it's a fundamental right, young people have, it's a fundamental right in the UNCRC, Article 12, young people have the right to play an active role in matters which affect them. And so, if we are, we're rights-based organisations, and this is an integral part of advancing that rights-based agenda. They are rights holders working with and alongside us. And I think, participatory research is fundamentally important. Taking on board all of the caveats that we've explored today, and recognizing that it's not about loosening the sort of the levels of robustness and methodological rigor and integrity, but designing research in such a way that young people and those with expertise through lived experience can play a contribution, and just because it's their fundamental right to do so, and it has all sorts of other positive spin-offs in terms of their own personal agency outcomes, group level outcomes. So there's, but it is, we shouldn't forget that it is actually just a fundamental right. I don't know if we can move on to the next group and talk about objective 2, and are we good to pause here and we know what the next stages are? It's been a really helpful discussion. Lots of things have been addressed, and so I'm going to move us on. And Jen, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. Yeah, so we had our initial meeting. We clarified our objectives from this objective 2, which is the reviewing of the state of the evidence. So we discussed that these were about documenting prospective and ongoing research that will enable us to identify evidence gaps, and from that we can develop and strengthen the evidence base. And we were also talking about it as an opportunity to improve the quality of the research through enabling support for those producing it, and at the same time promoting collaboration and encouraging and enabling the sharing of tools and methodologies and resources, and as well to reduce duplication. So by being able to see who else is working on a particular topic or in a particular region, that can help guide our decisions when we're thinking through new topics and where the gaps are. We talked through some of the key considerations, which I'll quickly mention now so that you can see some of the thinking that's happening in this group. So we talked about the need for the spreadsheet to be comprehensive and rigorous. We discussed curation and whether that would be needed. So it could be that we have somebody to organise, for example, spotlights on particular projects that are happening and workshops and these kinds of things. So that would be a sort of a knowledge management role. And whilst that could be done within this working group, we know that capacity is often an issue. So it might be that we could look for funding for this role and have the working group to support that person. We talked about whether users could add their own research, and if so, then less curation would be needed. But we're also keen to make sure that research is added when it's done by others outside of this group as well. We also talked about the need to keep the spreadsheet updated. So we know that when the spreadsheet was initially set up, people added their studies, the things they were working on at that point, but there hasn't been a continual updating over time. So that's something that would need to be addressed. And we talked about the possibility of embedding some kind of functionality. So for example, setting it up so that potential contributors were sent alerts, perhaps every 3 months or so, to nudge them to update the sheet. We were also talking about how we could incentivize people to use the platform and engage with it. So the incentives that we were talking about included just the fact that it's contributing to the public good. It also helps with promoting and getting work out to wider audiences, which I'm sure we're all very keen to do. We also, one suggestion was that contributors who are uploading their plans for research or their kind of early stage projects could be offered access to a biannual methodological review workshop, where they could benefit from professional review and input, which I think perhaps links back to what was being discussed a few minutes ago as well. There was a suggestion that contributors could be given an opportunity to have a personal or an organisational spotlight on the BCM website or maybe the newsletter, which would allow them to promote their work and their organisation, but also helping others to see who's out there and what they're working on, which could be useful for the wider community as well. And then finally, in terms of the incentives, just in terms if we were able to see clusters of studies emerging within a particular context or on a particular theme, then again that there could be opportunities to link all of those producers of research together. It could be that there's a webinar or something like that where people could come together and collaborate and share their learning. But we also acknowledge that these kinds of things are likely to require a dedicated role. We talked about the possibility to reduce the level of effort, the possibility for perhaps integrating the spreadsheet into something else that already exists. That could be the BCM platform. We could look to have a sub-platform within OSF. And then there was a brief conversation about about improvements or potential improvements that could be made to the spreadsheet. So there was a sense that it could be made a little bit more user-friendly, and noting that we'd need to be conscious of it could become unwieldy as it grows, and also that the categorization could probably do with a review and the taxonomies that we use within it. So then in terms of action points, the first one being that, to get a better understanding, I think particularly some of us in the group are quite new to this and weren't around for the initial conversations, to go back to those who set up the initial spreadsheet to get a little bit more context and make sure we're acting on all of the information. And then to do a bit of work clarifying who is the audience, and as well speaking to people who have or perhaps haven't used the form to learn why they have, why they haven't, if they have, whether they found it helpful, was it user friendly, what do they think could be improved. So that would be a kind of surveying the wider membership of this group. And then from that, we would develop a revised version for consultation to take back to the wider group that would then allow us to develop it further. So we'll have another meeting, I think, in the next couple of weeks, although I don't think we've quite established a date for that yet, to firm up who's going to take on these different actions. I think that's it in terms of an update from Objective 2, unless anyone else who was in the group, have I missed anything else to add?
That was really helpful, Jen, and I'm sorry that it wasn't uploaded onto the portal. I thought anyway, it's my mistake, but the notes are available and we can share them, and we'll make sure they get uploaded directly after this meeting, because of course I'm somebody who needs to read things to absorb them. I find it difficult to take on board just verbal feedback, so it will be we'd be delighted, you know, if people could have a look and give us any thoughts that they might have. But yeah, we'll follow up with the meeting in a couple of weeks. And I saw, Florence, that you suggested that we could today have a look at the updated repository and consider, you suggested we could actually have a look at it. Is that something that would be good to do now? Would people be interested to take a look? Has everybody seen it? Oh, Joe, I can see you talking, but no sound.
It's just saying not for a long time.
Okay, okay.
So what we wanted to do briefly is, with Margot's great help, we updated in the last version of the repository. Margot, if you can share it and show it, and you'll see that it's actually quite comprehensive, but it's very out of date. Can you also share the screen with the actual repository briefly, which is going to be hard to see? But you'll see that there are, I forget, is it 49 different pieces of research that were identified, that were by members, that were inputted by members. Some of them we know are already completed and it's mentioned. Others that are mentioned, there isn't information we know have been published. Some of them have not been published, but have been finalized, and there's a bunch of reasons why they haven't been published. But it kind of gives you a sense of what it is. Again, just to clarify, the database is an internal database for members of the working group, and we had discussion as to whether to widen it to the broader community in the platform, but it's primarily for the working group at this stage, on either planned or ongoing research. That's the idea of this database. It's not looking at it's meant to be looking at what's ongoing. Or what's being planned, not things that have already been published. The information is then categorized through Google form, where members are being asked to identify what kinds of methodology. I don't know whether you can show exactly. You can show there's a whole what the topic is, what kind of methodology is being used, to enable us to also identify the different types of methodology that are used and the different types of topics that are used. For those of you who remember the evidence working group when it started as a SurveyMonkey, and we shared the findings a couple of times that came out of that in terms of what research members were involved in at the time. And then we created a Google form for members of the group to be able to input any new research that they were doing. And Margot really helpfully brought together the two, so that we've got now a version through a Google form, which enables any of the members to actually update with any new research that they've been working on. It's not the as we discussed before, it's not the spreadsheet itself is not the easiest thing to manage. Any spreadsheet is always a bit challenging, but it does. It's certainly easier now in this version than it was after the SurveyMonkey version data was extracted. So one of the question is, and to share with you the Google form and with members, to share with you again the link to the database so you can see the result of it, and ask members, whether it's useful, whether they're able to update their own entries or update. And as we're having discussion about, is there a better way of doing this that we can build on what we already got in some ways rather than start from scratch again. So that's why we wanted to just show you what it is, and we'll repost this into the evidence working group, the link together with the Google form link, so members can add information or update information from what they've already added. The idea as well is, as you can see, is that you can also easily connect to a focal person who might be able to, if you're interested in particular methodology and so on, who you can reach out to and ask them. And so it's also about, as Jen pointed out, it's this cross-sharing of information and being able to learn about both what the research findings are, but also how they've done it and what's ongoing, what are they planning, and so that we're able to build on each other's work, but also avoid duplication and so on. So that's just what we wanted to share with you at this stage. The other thing that I think we also talked about a little bit in that group as well, and Jen and Tricia correct me, but was also this question of the published evidence. And we talked about, so not things that are ongoing and planned, but also how do we ensure that there is easier access to good quality evidence on different aspects of care, that's evidence which relates to the other objective around the evidence gap. And some of that discussion was also relating to having more curated spaces where the working group, for example, would be able to identify some of the key evidence, let's say on foster care, for example, some of the key evidence on lived experience in care, for example. It just enable the community to be clearer around where the evidence is and build on that. And so we've had some discussion around potentially having that, we said, for example, from the BCN side, we could do a curated section that this evidence working group would be able to contribute to in terms of determining where people would be able to easily access, particularly what we think is good quality research on different aspects of care. And so just wanted to also add that to the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Margot.
Yeah, thanks, Florence. Thanks, Margot. Jen, have you got any preliminary thoughts in relation to any of that?
Yeah, so I was really sticking with the with the objective, but yeah, missed that bit. So thanks, Florence, for the additional information that we talked about relating to the sort of the wider evidence base. And we were talking about the fact that they're really very linked, isn't it? And we were talking about, I think, a part of that conversation, I think one of the suggestions was there being a sort of a live, I think somebody mentioned live literature review, and it could be that this spreadsheet with the emerging research then feeds into that, isn't it? So there could be a mechanism whereby one feeds into the other. That's something for us to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, that relates very much to the evidence gap piece, doesn't it? Which I know you've talked in Innocenti about, Florence, and we're still not quite clear how we might land that piece of work, because obviously it's quite complex and challenging. Joe, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks. This is great. It's nice to see this moving forward. Well done. I was just wondering the connection between these first two objectives and whether what we're expecting to see in this database are those high-level standards of evidence or not. Because if I look at my entries in there, then it's very much not. I included evaluations that we were doing and things like that are very useful, and I think others could learn from, but not designed to be the kind of the rigorous evidence that we were talking about under the first objective. So I think it would be helpful to see what the connection is there, and maybe they don't need to go strictly together. It does make me think what you were saying, Florence, about a curated aspect of the BCN library. I wonder if there's a quality mark that we could develop,
yes,
be applied to some of the items on the BCN library when when we as a group feel through whatever method we come up with that things have met a certain standard, and that would kind of be like a kite mark, not that official, to direct people towards the ones that really do meet that standard, whilst still allowing access to others. And maybe there's kind of levels to that, to say, you know, this is fit for this kind of purpose, and this is suitable, you know, for different. I think there's different purposes, that not everything has to be in that really high rigor evidence bracket. They can still be useful even if they've been designed in a different way.
Yeah, and it might
exactly.
Yeah, it might be that paper gives us a framework to sort of come up with different levels, and we can we can assess the different studies against those, exactly as you're saying, Joe, but to do it in such a way that it's not necessarily a sort of damning judgment, but a sort of more of a sort of, you know, an analysis and assessment of, exactly as you're saying, this is the, you know, this is what this type of methodology, this is the you know, the rigor of the methodology, these are the extent to which the findings and the data can be trusted and are very useful for these types of purposes. So I think that would be, because there's no point doing all of these pieces of work if they're not connected in somehow. And it strikes, you know, because one of the things that we did talk about, which I know Jen has just mentioned, is, you know, what are the incentives for people to engage with and keep this updated, and actually using this repository as a hook to get people to engage in, you know, methodology workshops, to improve the quality or to strengthen the quality of their methodologies. That might be a way of, you know, staircasing people through some of these levels as well. Jen, I can see, oh, I don't know who had your hand up first, Florence or Jen.
I think Jen.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe with each piece you could almost have sort of users notes, because I think that's something that I've encountered certainly in our organisation. I don't know if others have found the same, where perhaps people who are less research experienced, you know, how well can I generalise this, or, you know, if this study is looking at this particular population, can I use it to say this? Almost kind of like yeah, notes on things like generalizability, or kind of notes of caution, or, you know, or the other sort of, if there's what, you know, what this really is telling us, and how it might be used. I don't know, I'm just thinking
it's like an abstract.
Yeah,
it could be part of an abstract, couldn't it? Some sort of peer review summary of the purposes for which the research can be legitimately used, or used to inform. I think that, yeah, I mean, I think, and using that paper produced by the first group as the framework to pull some of those things out would be really helpful. And Florence?
Yeah, no, really following up on what Joy's saying, that was exactly the idea. It's really important that the database itself, the repository, is not the repository of the evidence that we think is quality, because we want to encourage organizations to put up what they're doing in terms of research, and the more inclusive it is, the more transparent it is, the better the community is going to be off at the end of the day, because we're trying to improve. And so it's also a sense of, what are you working on? It may not be necessarily the highest quality, but this is what you're working on, and you're sharing it with others, which enables the community to feel comfortable about discussing about methodology and more transparent. The curation, though, is exactly right. The curation would need to be based on an analysis of what we think is the high quality. And so having this group and having, you know, building on the work that's being done in Objective 1, but then finding a mechanism whereby we would then determine what goes in the curated section, and an ongoing, I think it needs to be live, absolutely, because otherwise, like this depository, it becomes stale if we don't have it with new research and clarity around. So having the curated and having a mechanism for this community to determine, yeah, this piece of research is really critical for us to understand, I don't know, the impact of foster care. But another one, we might say there are limitations to it that actually may not necessarily make it the top 5 or the top 10 things, you know, we want to have on different aspects. So how do we do that? And I think this is where we're hoping this group can really help us move towards that.
Thanks, Florence. I don't know if anybody has any further. Justin.
Yeah, hi Trish. Yeah. So yeah, just a couple of points on that. So I think definitely, I think you have to be a little cautious about sort of setting up hierarchies of evidence, though, that this isn't just saying that all randomized controlled trials is what we're after. You know, that's my only note of caution on that, because I think, as sort of Joe was suggesting, it's horses for courses with some of this stuff as well, isn't it? It is that sort of situation for a practitioner that's working in the field somewhere that wants to try something different in their practice. And if there's some specific research evidence around that issue, then that, you know, whether that's the gold standard of randomized controlled trials or not is one thing to be cautious of. But also, I think one thing that we did discuss in that meeting as well was the benefits of it in terms of it being a networking tool. So not to rule people out from putting stuff on there, get people to put things on there. So, you know, if you are then looking at maybe going off to do a project in Kenya or Ghana or wherever, you can see the researchers that are actively working in that geographical area, even not necessarily whether it's about methodology, but who's working in what regions, what countries, on what projects. I think is got value in as well. Yeah,
I think that's a really important point. That's sort of encouraging that the development of a sort of peer support community around research, and, you know, working to strengthen the quality of research methodologies and outputs in line with the overarching agenda of this working group. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely key. I don't know if there's any final comments. I know that we wanted to talk about Objective 3. Victoria, I know you were involved in sort of facilitating a small group discussion around that, so I want to pass on to you in a second. And we also do want to allow some, you know, a few minutes at the end to do a roundup in case there's anything that people would like to share that we haven't been able to discuss today. So just pause for any final comments on Objective 2 before passing over to Victoria. Does anyone have anything? No? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to hand over now to Victoria to talk about the third objective, which I know was around the identifying the gaps. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. So yeah, workstream 3, objective 3. Myself with Florence, Maria Herzog and Jen got together a couple of weeks ago, starting with huge apologies to Justin and anyone else who had hoped to be part of that conversation, and apologies for if I have missed any names off the list, but we certainly recognise that it was a starter of a conversation, and there'll be plenty of room for everybody to get involved as and when we move forward. But yeah, this objective is really about the kind of taking stock and looking forward to a kind of future-looking research agenda. So as the slide there says, it's about detection of gaps in the research, research priorities, an agenda for the group. And I think something else that I'd seen in the previous notes was around potentially a research initiative, a global kind of research initiative that could look to fill those gaps and work on progressing the field. Overall, I think we recognise that it's a really huge piece of work that's going to take some time to get to grips with. So I guess it starts with a plea for patience and your expertise as we go along. Florence did talk to us about the conversations you'd had in Objective 2, and we saw a very close connection between the two. So there will be lots of crossovers and collaboration. And then the other sort of point of discussion was really around previous efforts made to review the literature, and particularly by Better Care Network, similar efforts by other organisations, the challenges and solutions around the methodologies that might be used, such as rapid review methodologies, and looking at some of the examples, for example, from the Ascenti Research Centre on with the review around disability. So we picked up some areas that we want to review together to understand a bit what has been done, what can be done, and what might be a good way forward. And I think what we felt we're broadly aiming for, and of course the rest of the group jump in as we go along or afterwards if I'm misrepresenting anything, but I think we're looking for broadly starting with a conceptual framework to determine what's in and what's out of our research field, what constitutes the care research field that we're looking at, the themes, etc. then a catalogue of issues, the research available on those topics, and an assessment of the gaps around it. And then moving forward to an agreed research agenda that would move the field forward, and which different stakeholders can identify their place within. So hoping to keep a kind of a scope for different researchers and different stakeholders to see their place within that research agenda and what they can contribute. So in practice, we talked about that being us as a group, the Evidence for Impact group, co-developing the kind of the definitions and the framework to clarify a scope of work. That crossed over with things like the advocacy working group work on definitions, and kind of how we form the conceptual framework for that. We felt was something that we would do internally within this group. Then we would probably look to hire a research body to do a rapid review or similar, which would require securing funds to do so first, because that would be a significant undertaking. So whilst we can do a lot of the preparation, we feel that really doing the research, the review, depending on which methodology we chose to pursue, that would be something that we would need additional resources to do, and then with that review, then again coming back to the group to use that to inform the development of a collaborative research agenda. So you can see there's a lot that we don't have a specific output like the first objective. You've got a paper already. It's I think a more contained piece of work that of course will take development, but I think you've made a really concrete start on that objective. I think with objective 3 it is going to be a longer term endeavour, and I think that, I hope, encapsulates what we talked about. So I think I'll leave it there and open up to anyone else in the group who's got comments.
Are there any comments or questions for Victoria? I mean, I take on board, I think your point about the fact that this is a sort of a more evolutionary piece of work. You know, that's well noted, and I know. Oh, Florence, sorry, I can't see your hand because it's very similar to the background on your screen, so I see it very late. Please do come in. I know that you've had some experience, haven't you, of trying to engage Innocenti to do a piece of work around this, and I'm sure the group would benefit from hearing more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tricia. I have to change the color of my hand. No, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to Victoria. That was a brilliant summary of a conversation that was quite complex. We were all brainstorming together, so that was a fantastic summary. Just to reinforce what Victoria said, that the group was thinking that the first step is also to clarify that conceptual framework, that what we're going to be, when we talk about an evidence agenda, what is the field that we're actually going to be reviewing in terms of where the evidence is, and having clarity, which is actually the conversation within Innocenti that we had, was to start by clarifying that framework of research, or that, I don't know, that landscape, I don't know what the right language is, but around the parameters of the research, because of course you could widen this so widely when you talk about children's care that it ends up becoming about everything, and it becomes an impossible job to actually do any proper review of literature. So starting to clarify that, and the challenge, as Victoria said very well, is that it links up to clearly some of the other objectives, but it also does require, moving forward with that clarification around, what do we think the landscape in terms of, for use of maybe the wrong word, around research, around children's care, what are the parameters, what goes under there? And then the second big challenge is, what is the right methodology? If right is the right word, what is the both the right, but also the one that we can we can afford. You know what I mean? What is going to be practical as well in terms of doing. So we were, keen to learn from the review that was done by UNICEF recently around disability, as Victoria mentioned, where they went through review of literature around children and disability. But learn also from you and others about different methodologies and have a discussion around, once we have a sense of our conceptual framework, what is actually both the feasible, but also the best way to approach and identify gaps. And then the next step, of course, is the prioritization of gaps, because the idea is we want to come up with an agenda that identify where we see the gaps, where the gaps are, but also that says these are really key priorities that we would want to, that we would want donors, research bodies, and so on to go behind and help us address. So that's really quite a massive undertaking for this group. But we thought, let's start with, which is not an easy one, the first thing, which is to help clarify that domain of research and evidence that we want to actually review in terms of identifying where the evidence is and where the gaps are, if that makes sense. But we need more people in that group, and we need more brains and more experience around how it's been done. So part of what we were discussing as well is, if we had some funds, could we hire somebody to actually do some of that work for us? I mean, that was the intention with Innocenti as well, to kind of move forward, both in terms of the conceptual framework, but also the approach to the review of the literature. If that makes sense.
One question: if UNICEF have recently undertaken something, a comparable piece of work in a related domain, would it be possible to get somebody who was involved in that piece of work to come and talk to the group to describe what the process was they used? Because that sometimes just understanding, and you might have already spoken to them, Florence, I suspect you probably have, but whether or not, having them come and sort of share some of the pitfalls, I'm thinking, because it's always useful to understand what the things to avoid are as well as the things to do, whether that could be a possibility.
Definitely. We did speak with them quite a while ago when they started on it, and they were still at a very initial stage. So it'd be useful to actually catch up with them to actually see what progress they made and yeah, exactly as you said, what were the challenges. I think it'd be really interesting as well to hear from other sectors, because I think this one is a fairly recent one, and it had a very clear purpose, which was, it was very much the implementation of UNICEF strategy on children and disability. So they had already a very clear focus. But it'd be also useful to hear from others that have done similar reviews for different purposes. And there are, as you know, bodies that actually are focused in the UK and other places that are focused precisely on doing this literature review for policymakers as well. And
yes.
So learning about these different methodologies, the pros and cons, of course, of different ways of reviewing the evidence and developing an agenda would be really helpful. But we felt that we would need the extra capacity to be able to do that, clearly.
Yeah, I know someone who used to work for Cochrane, because the Cochrane review process is one of those sort of processes in the UK, isn't it, that sort of pioneered these methodologies. I could see, I don't know what she's doing now, but I could see if she might give us a sort of 101 on the process. She would have been involved, she worked for Cochrane, so she would have been involved in the process of doing multiple reviews on different topics. If that would be useful, I could reach out and see.
I think it'd be really useful, but as you know, Cochrane is really looking at academic literature. It's looking at, my understanding of it is systematic reviews primarily. And so going back to our discussion on objective one, as we know, a lot of the evidence in this is not in the academic literature, such as it is. Let me qualify that. So yes, exactly. How is that done? But you're right. I mean, and we were talking with Chris Cuthbert at the time. He used to work for the, I forget what it was called, but the unit in the UK government many years ago, the research body that was doing precisely that type of rapid review of literature for government policy, with all the limitation that might bring, but it also was very practical. And there are bodies that continue to do that. So learning from these different methodologies and looking at what kind of process they use and what kind of literature, what kind of evidence they're looking at.
And do we have anyone here? Marinus, Marianne, and Justin? Who are the academics on the call? Have you got experiences of using these types of, doing these sort of rapid reviews, or have colleagues maybe? And Sarah, I think you're an academic as well, aren't you? And Maria, there's a few of you, aren't there, on the call?
Yeah. The idea was, oh, sorry.
Oh, I've done systematic reviews before, yes.
Yeah. Wondering if, you know, what expertise we could harness as a sort of starting point for developing a framework. I mean, the parameters is a different issue, isn't it? Sort of how, you know, how much or how little, that's something that needs to be decided. And that's maybe something we could decide within this larger group.
Yeah,
But,
and it's not that difficult, especially because as an academic, I have access to my university library staff.
yes.
And they're the ones who are really experts at developing the keyword searches and figuring out which databases to pull from and helping us document exactly what we do.
Excellent.
Just to add, Tricia, I'd be interested in getting involved in that. I've done one systematic review, but if there are colleagues that are interested in doing one, I know Marinus has done lots, right? I'm forever citing Marinus's work, so and Marianne's, of course. Yes.
Yeah, though it's never rapid.
No. Systematic, but not rapid, huh?
Is that a misnomer then?
Definitely.
Yeah, I don't know.
There are different things on there. There are different things, I think, my
Sure.
understanding. And that's why it's
Yeah.
important to have that discussion, because there are different things, looking at different types of evidence.
Yes.
Which goes back to this question of, you know, what do we consider evidence and what we review? We know that in our field, there's a real lack of empirical evidence on many aspects of children's care. So if we're going to focus only on those that can be reviewed through systematic review of literature that don't just come up with there isn't enough evidence to do that, we need to be thinking about.
And I can see that Maria, she's got her hand up.
Yeah.
Maria.
Yeah, I was just suggesting already earlier that we should focus on the language issues here also, because obviously it's not easy to look at the English only literature. So there are so many things out there, never translated, never known, recognized, just because they are not published internationally. I'm not sure about the quality, it might be anything, but obviously in many countries there are researchers who have no access to international journals. A colleague of ours has just published an interesting article. I will send it to you, that, for instance, those coming from Eastern Europe or other developing countries are not published often in highly valued or very respected English-speaking journals, just because of the language issues or just because of the prejudice or stereotyping. So there are a lot of materials out there that wouldn't come up with any search engine just because of the language issues. The other issue I wanted to raise, we've been talking about this previously, that perhaps as there are capacity issues, perhaps some PhD students could be attracted, or students who would be interested in working on these matters and supported by us. So I can imagine that tutoring or supporting students who are interested in doing this kind of work would be helpful. And this is another, so to say, channeling, partly also attracting young people to do research on child protection, child welfare, because I don't see too much enthusiasm, to be honest.
That's a really interesting thought, because that is one of the discussions as well that hasn't really come up today, but has taken place in previous meetings of this group. The urgent need to try and bring in younger researchers, particularly from lower middle income contexts, who are wanting to sort of, you know, forge a career but find access, and identifying a career pathway particularly challenging. And actually this is something that could be of interest to someone like that. So that's a really interesting thought.
Yeah,
and so
especially because it's, I was just going to say, because if we're talking about developing a research agenda, who's going to fulfill that research agenda? And it is
yes,
the younger generation of researchers, because there is a lifetime's worth of research to do here as the care landscape changes over time. And so
yeah.
getting that kind of young research talent involved would be really fantastic for so many reasons.
Yeah, and particularly from contexts where, you know, it's not the usual suspects, you know, where we're engaging a wider range of participants in these discussions, particularly from contexts that are directly impacted by the issues, you know, that we're looking at as researchers. So in terms of next steps for that group, Victoria, what would you, Florence made the call for more participants. So I think we had Justin sign up, and I think, did somebody else sign up as well who wasn't involved before? Sarah, did you sign up and you weren't involved before? Maybe you did participate previously, I can't remember. So have you got more participants? Have you got enough people to take?
Well, I think there was a couple more on the spreadsheet people who had added more recently, one of which, Florence, you said was a young researcher from I'm not sure which country she was from, but was coming from a different context. So sounded
from
like
India.
a good addition to the group.
At Harvard University, finishing I think a PhD at Harvard. Yeah.
Exactly. So we'll reach out to her and get her. But yes, if there's any other recommendations or people who want to get involved, then do. We didn't pin down next steps, but I guess the next step is, you know, we haven't put any of this down in writing. I can do that and pop it out there on the group, and then we can set up our next meeting, perhaps in May, for the small group to look where we go next with this.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I don't know if there's any final comments on that objective. No. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. We agreed that we wouldn't discuss priority 4 because we need to come back to that at a later stage. So I'm just going to pause now for any roundups, anything that people would like to share, bring to the attention of the group. And we've already had information about the webinar, which is on May the 9th, looking at participatory research. Are there any other announcements, Florence, that it would be useful to share now?
From our side, one thing maybe, which is actually linked also to this webinar, but we have quite a lot of work at the moment going on as part of the Transforming Children's Care with Care Experience. We have 2 groups that are led by Care Experience individuals. And one discussion right now is with INTRAC, which is
INTRAC,
the research network that is doing work around transitioning from care. And we're discussing with them doing a presentation to the task force of Care Experience Young Person, precisely to present the evidence so far in terms of research in relation to transitioning from different regions. Now that's going to be a closed meeting for the task force. The task force is working on a thematic brief around transitioning, so it needs to hear the evidence. But it struck me with discussion from INTRAC member how important it would be to bring INTRAC members to the evidence working group, having them participate, having them share their work, and also potentially doing a presentation for the evidence working group, or doing it as a webinar, whatever would make sense. But I just thought that would
Florence, may I just add that we were also talking about ISKI as a possible source for information and cooperation. But also there is a new group also led by Harriet Ward, partly, on very young children entering the care system. It's an international network we have set up before the COVID, and it's also active. I can send you the website details. So this is another option besides INTRAC.
Thanks, Maria.
Talking of other groups, I noticed recently that there will be an EU SARF conference here in Sussex, in Brighton, where I am, in September or October. And I just wondered, I'm not too familiar with the group, and I wondered if others are, and whether that's worth having on our radar or interacting with.
Yeah, I'm going along to that one, Victoria. It's down in Brighton, University of Sussex. But yeah, I've been to their conferences a couple of times before, USARF, and they are very good. They're every other year. So this year it's in Brighton. but I'll be there if anyone else, any other colleagues are there. It'd be good. Perhaps we could meet as a working group if anyone else is going.
Fantastic. I live really locally, so I'll see you there.
Great.
But yeah, maybe I'd love to learn more about the network, because it seems to be, am I right in saying it's kind of European, mostly European, but other international universities and academics who predominantly are involved in that network around alternative care. So there might be some interesting connections for us.
And I think actually colleagues from Intrac go to that conference as well. I think they have meetings there as well. So no, it's a really useful forum. They did try and launch a journal at one point, but I don't think it was very successful. The journal that they tried to launch, but yeah, it's definitely a conference worth going to. Especially across the European perspectives.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Justin.
Excellent. Well, I think we've got 30 seconds left. Any final comments? Thanks for your time, everybody. So next steps, we're all going to break away into our small groups, do some more work, reconvene in a couple of months. So good luck with everyone's endeavours, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.